Lueur dans le ciel avec les troublants. Couche le doigt dans la terre, respire le vent. Plonge dans la rivière des infiniment. Tes yeux plus grands ouverts pour après le temps.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We at Lost City Books are so very pleased to have these authors, joining us this evening, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about them. But first, if you're brand new, we are Lost City Books, an independent bookstore in the heart of Adams Morgan, Washington, D.C., and we specialize in used, new, and rare books. Our new space, renovated as of January and February 2020, generates engagement and enrichment from the surrounding community, inviting artists, activists, organizers, authors, of course, and educators, many of whom are reflected in our staff from the area and from now the nation, to share their knowledge and skills. I'm your host this evening, Shady Rose. Kemi Alabi was born on a Sunday in July. I was born on a Sunday too, Kemi. A poet and cultural strategist, Alabi is the author of Against Heaven, selected by Claudia Rankine as the winner of the 2021 Academy of American Poets First Book Award, and co-editor of the Echoing Ida collection. Alabi's work appears in Poetry, The Atlantic, Boston Review, The Breakbeat Poets Volume 2, and elsewhere. Raised in southeastern Wisconsin, they now live in Chicago, Illinois, where I hear it's pretty hot today. Taylor Johnson is from Washington, D.C. He is the author of Inheritance, Alice James Books 2020, winner of the 2021 Norma Farber First Book Award from the Poetry Society of America. His work appears in Poetry Magazine, The Paris Review, The Baffler, Scalawag, and elsewhere. Johnson is a Cave Canem Graduate Fellow and a recipient of the 2017 Larry Neal Writers Award from the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, and the 2021 Judith A. Markowitz Award for Emerging Writers from Lambda Literary. Taylor is the inaugural 2022 poet in residence at the Guggenheim Museum. Snaps. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome our two guests. Hello, everyone.
Hello. Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
I'm really pleased to have the both of you. I think we've got a real treat in store. But first of all, queer Black high five for everybody. Boop. I think I would really love to hear both of your thoughts on these poems, but I know that you have agreed to just launch right in with a reading and then discuss those poems. So if you'd like to get started, please do.
Sure. I was really excited to invite Taylor Johnson to this reading because, first of all, amazing poet, have been clutching Inheritance since it came out. But then when Lost City reached out, DC Bookstore, DC being so much a part of the poems in Inheritance, I knew who I wanted to have this conversation with, just to honor the location of Lost City Books. But also because there's so much in our collections that I feel are approaching similar places from different vantage points. And I wanted to be in conversation about some of those similarities that I saw. So I would love to, Taylor and I talked about, or I suggested a light theme of music, since sound and music are so prominent in our poems. So, and we talked about both launching into poems, both sharing a poem or two, and then getting into some conversation. So Taylor, maybe I start with a poem and you can follow, and then we chat.
That sounds good, Kemi.
Cool. So I'm gonna start with a poem, since I suggested music. There's so many lyrics in the poems in Against Heaven, through Golden Shovels or other avenues. And I'm going to start with what I feel is my most indulgent poem. A financial planner asks about my goals, or Golden Shovel with Cardi B's money. Never touch starved again. Forever a chub-bellied baby sexed big. Skin a heat-mapped catalog of hands, still wet, still grasping, still blood fat. Behind every steam-slammed door, play plush beds as good as checks. Whole home stitched with only these rooms, only this near rip big. Kitchen table, perfect island for the stranding, meals propped heaven lodge. Backyard, a honey-dripped grove named Eden, ripe land of no bills. Whatever drops first, spice adorned, sauce slicked back to front, splayed open slow, tempting a spill, grateful to be devoured like I'll make my giggling groommates. Spit-tethered hips churned tender, flip down, smeared open growls or whole wedding cakes or any drown we like. Just measure by the fistful how thick this slick can coat a sigh. Add 10, and that'd be balm enough to dizzy trip my lonely and her cartwheels. What you got, Taylor? This is a cipher, actually.
Yeah, so the thing is, I mean, number one, I just want to say thank you again for inviting me and having me. Yeah, I am a little torn because I kind of want to read this poem that I love by Christopher Gilbert. Or I could read one from Inheritance, or I was going to read a new poem. So I'm actually going to let you choose.
It's got to be the new shit.
Okay, cool. So I'm still working on it, but it's called Was. Was amongst the sound as sound. Was in the parking lot taking the pressure off. Was indistinguishable from. Was the profit together in the crown scheme? Was the whole being better? Was eliding, was sliding on the economic machine? Was made method and mess? Was my neighbor coordinates? Wasn't myself strange? Was the pneuma? Was known? Was caught up in the pussy complex? Come on. Was loose, linger, was leaving, beginning, was folded, what oneness suggested, was born wandering, was persistent, Lord, in our arrangement, Was in my waistband, yes it was being, yeah, was written, was rare treatise, this science ever since, was eternal rather, was the outline of rhythm fallen, was travelers all, was hearsay, was you filled again, was seeking the beautiful collapse, was no strain, was only to start, was the momentarily incorporated society for the moment. Was the metaphysical imperative, was turbulent and green, was opulence, all of it, was dirty, such as every associated fluid, was a little piss in there, was yes being the unit of engagement, was the words didn't really matter, was slowed up anyway, was the regal procession, was as a river go, was no law where it came from, was from the great assumption taken in, was where you going looking like that, was the new analysis, was lifting the ancient veil, was when saying we was just in the parking lot after all, was elsewhere let out, was owned, been new, was now and then, was the trees somewhere, was itself time, was speaking the dead up, was them on this airbrush, was poured as fire, was burst miraculously on the back line, was everyone falls in, was love sometimes, was to enter the divine field, was only 4 a.m., was just yesterday, was according to the uninitiated, was limits here, was just the parking lot, just was something else, was until the collaborative monastic pursuit was wanting it all right now, was this knowledge to dwell in, was outside, was where, was pulling night as historical research, was wealth in the center, was the center everywhere, was the work of dispersal, was carrying on okay, was work okay, was the necessary response, was beyond all this bullshit, was one among us asking, was to be studied, was what it tasted like, was passing smoke, was an open mouth, was waiting to be breathed by, was just in a parking lot, was no lights, was making it look good for the camera, baby, was the original emanation, was touching almost, was higher than, was carried off, was endurance in water, was becoming that. It's not done or anything, but it's a continuation of something.
Those are both so beautiful. Thank you both for reading. Did you want to continue trading off a few more, or do you want to kind of talk about those a little bit?
What you feel, Kemi?
Maybe let's do one more.
Cool.
Because you said you wanted to bring another voice in here.
Yeah.
And then maybe I'll read another one from the book.
Cool.
I'm going to read Black As, which is a poem in 2 parts. The second, a bit of an inversion and an erasure of the first. Black As. First, the wound. Not all of us survived. Grief came home, back to our throats, our lungs. Grief been black, blue black, tires bald between work and home black, Monday through Sunday double shifts black, asked about those visions, if spirits still slicked my mother's sleep, and she said she's too tired to dream, too tired to see nothing but black. Grief came home to our lead thick water, our Big Mac breakfast greasing the way between work and home black. Begged her to take sick time, but not a day off in 10 years black. Said the place would fall apart without her, but not a raise in 10 years black. Needs the health insurance. Dad used 9 diapers all before noon. Don't make pillboxes big enough black. And the co-pays alone. Not all of us survive. Not all living is surviving. A virus can't take what they already stole, our land, our labor, our language, our magic, our minds, our time. But all my mother's mail tries to tell her what she owes. How much will her burial cost? Death, another debt black. Grief, a bill where the body was black. News, all markets and borders and shouts, and nothing we can live on. No news, still bad news, Black. Learned about the virus on the clock when the packages he shipped became essential. Learned about the virus when Pastor got sick, though he was covered in the blood, though she made third, fourth jobs of prayer. Learned about the virus when the cough came, when the clinic wouldn't answer the phone. Remembered what the ER cost last time, so I just stayed home. When even the stores in the white neighborhoods had nothing on the shelves. When the calls from the cousins up in county came, and even their pitch was a fever. Black is a wound, yes, 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 and, Black is a portal. Black as portal. And even their pitch was a fever. Became essential. Shouts we can live on. A bill the body. O's for our magic. All living would fall apart without our Black, greasing the way between home and home grief, our thick water spirit, vision double, shifts Black, mother blue, back home.
Yeah, I really did that. Thank you. There's this line, and have you read Don Lundy Martin's Good Stock, Strange Blood? You know that line that's kind of towards the beginning, that's like no death, only the door. Yeah, I thought about that when I first read that poem, and when you were reading it now, I kind of focus on that image of the portal, Black as a portal. Yeah, that's pretty good. I'm gonna read this poem by Christopher Gilbert. It's just one of my, you know Christopher Gilbert? So yeah, he won the same award your junk won in 1983 for Across the Mutual Landscape. You know, this is my favorite book. Listening to Monk's Mysterioso, I remember braiding my sister's hair. What it's all about is being just beyond a man's grasp, which is a kind of consciousness you can own. To get to be at a moment's center and let it keep on happening, knowing you don't own it, which is moving yourself close to being particular to that place. Like my two sisters taking turns braiding each other's hair growing against their weaving, they formed a flow their hurt and grace could mean, as each took turns pulling the comb through the other's knots and their little Vaseline. A knowing which makes the world a continuity, as in your core something calls to you at a distance which does not matter. As in the world you will see yourself listening to follow like water following its wave to shore. To arrive in your life, you must embrace this letting, which is a match for the stream through flowering field and all the tall trees wandered into and the river wearing beads just ahead, which you go into further on because you can. This going so is something else, the way it flows into always something deeper and over your head, a kid with why questions. Your answer is a moment struggling to be more than itself. You're straining for air to have the chance to breathe it free. It's alive you've come to, this coming into newness, this discontinuous mind and you looking up, finding an otherness which trusts what you'll become. For me, my sisters once offering, you want to learn to braid my hair? If we are blessed in this world, it is in feeling this, i.e. there are circumstances and you are asked to be their member, not owning, but owning in a participation like monks' implied words reaching for their sentence. If you can, get to it. I just wanted to bring his voice here. I really dig his poems, you know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's chat.
Yeah.
I promised that I wouldn't turn this into Taylor Johnson's Inheritance show, though I'm ready to, and I'm down.
Right on. We're not gonna allow that to happen though. So.
Oh, okay. You'll box me out question-wise. Well, I'll let you start then.
Cool. So there's something that I wanted to talk about with your poems that I noticed when I first read them, which is this theme that I feel in an embodied sense between like the erotic and the economic. Can you just talk about that for a moment?
Yeah. I love this because I think I wrote that in my notes also about your work. And to me, the collection begins with two epigraphs. One is from Audre Lorde's Uses of the Erotic. The erotic is power. And I needed to have her words at the very top because her concept of the erotic is so embedded in not just these poems, but my living. There's something about in my read of her work, the attunement to one's own true desire, the attunement to the erotic in the sense of what enlivens the body, not necessarily inherently in the sexual sense, but that attunement makes anything that disrupts that relationship, that connection to the body, anything that is in the way of that intimacy, that intimate knowing, is the enemy and must go. And so when I think about all of our systems, but racial capitalism as a system that is that estranges us from one another, us from the land, and us from ourselves. There's something powerful in the idea of the erotic as a point of reconnection, reestablishing that relationship that our economic system intentionally destroys, where our bodies are exploited and made to be of use for aims completely outside our own pleasure. And so it became really important for me, especially as I was working in movement spaces that are trying to dismantle these systems, but also on a really interpersonal and embodied level. We're still operating at this level of intense estrangement, estrangements that were replicated in all the relationships that folks were trying to form. It felt really important for me to explore in my poems from a really personal, embodied sense what it means to be really adamant about that connection, about that erotic connection, about that sense making. And then especially as someone who used to call myself a brain in a jar, as someone who comes from a very utilitarian family of folks doing hard, intense labor and who have been forced to be estranged from our own wants because of this economic system. It felt there are ways to talk about that on a structural level. There are ways to, there are essays we could write that have already been written about it. But the personal exploration through poetry of the erotic felt really important to me to get that lyric knowledge of what it means to be embodied. And then once that lyric knowledge is discovered in a really true, like sonic sense, embodied sense, how does that empower me as the writer, anyone as a reader, to hold on to that connection throughout the day? I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I dig that. I want to know a little more because that was perfectly clear. I think my second, can I keep asking questions? I'm not trying to. Well, I'm just curious because I feel like that's such a clear answer in a thematic sense. And I'm wondering what it means, like in the space of a poem, to, let's say, use the formal constraint, which we can see as a kind of economy of like the golden shovel, you know what I mean? Like economic constraint of the golden shovel, to then contend with like the lyrical or erotic notion that you want to imbue that language with? How you contend with that in the composition of a poem? I'm wondering.
Yeah, I love to experiment with different forms, and I think of the formal possibilities being as expansive as our physical bodies. I think of the poem's form as the poem's body, and though there's maybe like a few different ways that we're told they look, we know that there are infinite possibilities there, and so I appreciate approaching a poem through a received form or something, or a formal idea, because to me that is the body that I'm living in. And then the lyric becomes, this blood, this pulse that is making the body come alive. Specifically with the golden shovels, though, there's I do love a formal constraint, because otherwise I'm really out here. Like I from just a composition perspective, that that constraint is really useful for me. I love the challenge and the puzzle and the opportunity to specifically with the golden shovels, to be in conversation. There's like an intertextual conversation that I get to have with primarily music. I consider myself coming to poetry as perhaps a failed musician, like language is the instrument, English is my instrument. And womp womp, like, sorry for that. To me, it's so, unfortunately, and maybe my thoughts will change, but it feels very secondary to the sonic outside of language, which I want to talk to you about once I get to ask my questions. But, and so I also, from that orientation to sound, believe in the power of just the single syllable, the economy of words, outside of this idea of, because it's still a very indulgent collection, still very expansive. I feel like it's all like abundance, abundance, abundance. And I still really believe in the power of the single word to tell it all. And so when I get a received form, it allows me that constraint really allows every syllable to have to do a job, which I think happens in all poems. But then how is this in relationship to these received words that I'm getting? And I suppose when I think about the form as its body, I get an opportunity to also like bust against it. They're kind of bursting too. So it's not, to me, it's only a limit because otherwise it would be completely boundless. It's a container that feels necessary for, especially when ideas feel way too expansive to me. So the reason I'm explaining is because the word economy, I never want it to feel like there is a limit. Again, it's like abundance, abundance, abundance. And so I've been learning, your craft trouble is your life trouble. That's what Cynthia De Wyoka says. I have, I can really push against structures and constraints. Like, no, they should just disappear. But then, so it was a process actually for me via poetry to accept the love of the container, the love of that body and the economy that are allowed in my practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really dig that. Yeah, I feel like I'm very curious about the poem in your conception. Like, I see poems sometimes as like these movements that are social, you know what I mean? And our words kind of have their place in the society of the poem, you know what I mean? And like kind of the animating force, I guess, if I'm thinking about what you just said about your poems, it's like there is eros, or that method of persuasion that is eros, that kind of drives the lyrical moment or movement rather. Yeah, I really dig that. Yeah.
I'm glad this was recorded because I will be using that exact sentence for the rest of my life. May I ask you a question now? I'm so curious about your take on language as sound, as song. There's so much in your collection that to me reads as maybe a tension between language and sound outside of language. And I wanted to, one, wonder if you agree with that assessment, that that tension exists. You have, but I'm just going to my notes. In one of your poems, you have the line, I'm convinced that before becoming music, music was only a word. And I feel like throughout your collection, I'm getting kind of this slippage between the primacy of sound, the primacy of language, and then, maybe that disappears by the end. But I wanted to hear more from you about the relationship between sound and language, specifically in the collection. And then if you're in the days since completing it, if you've had any shifting thoughts or poems holding theories about that relationship.
Right now, I feel like maybe I'm in a different place than where I was when this came out, or even definitely in the composition of these poems. So I'll speak to where this book is getting to, which I think is trying to ride the line. And part of it for me is that in the moment of composition, in the process of composition of these poems, I was walking a lot in DC. And it being the first book, and I know that you probably feel similarly, there's you have a whole life of reference, a whole life of language and sound. And then to distill those things, I think it can be a bit of a hard line to walk, you know what I mean? Because honestly, what I like about poems is the way that they create this sonic surround for me. Like the poems that I love put me into a hole of sound. They put me in a trance, you know what I mean? And there's a method in my composition of poems that I'm looking to not only enlist myself in this trance making process with language, but also to hopefully pass it on to you as somebody who's reading it. Part of that is because I grew up where I did and listen to go-go music it's very percussive. It's very much about this sonic collapse of sound and surround that can be generated by people, strangers participating in this particular movement of bodies and music that is almost, the word improvise is not what I'm going to use, but it is the closest thing to what I'm trying to say. The other thing though is that I love poetry for the line breaks. I love the music that can come from a really good line, you know what I mean? And the meaning that comes from that line. So I think a lot of what I wanted to do in this book was to make some strange things happen on the line. And sometimes those things are sonically strange or imagistically strange, lyrically strange. So I think that's where I was. I was at a point of formulating these poems that come from years of curiosity in language and sound. I also consider myself a failed musician, or I just haven't really found my instrument yet. I used to play the drums, but I don't know. Yeah. What'd you play?
Oh, well, now we're going to get into gender trouble, which maybe we could also talk about how that exists in the poems, because I was kind of enlisted to play the clarinet in a band because that's what the girl children played. That's not what I wanted to play. I wanted to play the drums. Yeah. But that's the instrument I got very, very good at. And now I have this really contentious relationship to it because I don't even like the way it sounds. No shade to reed instruments, but that wasn't what I was feeling.
Wasn't it? Yeah.
No.
So do you listen to people playing the clarinet now and you're like, oh, I want to do that, or I know what they're doing? No.
I mean, it's never I want to do that. I always get excited when I can hear clarinet because they're also meant to blend, you know. So whenever I hear its particular timbre, I'm like, I hear you. You do your thing. That's a great tone. But no, that's never what I'm searching for. It's always, I mean, there's yeah, it's always something else. And so I feel that distance, it feels like language is what was afforded to me, like literally what I could afford when it comes to sound making, outside of what was forced on me. But you wanted to play the drums, did
Yeah,
you?
I did. I
Yeah.
did.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I took lessons, and so I started playing like percussion, like a djembe, when I was like 4 or something like that. And I played for a while, and I started playing the set and like other percussion instruments. But I think most of it is just because I lived here, and like the music is go-go music, so I wanted to be a part of that sound. That sound was, in me from the landscape, because I was grown within this landscape. But I think that the closest thing that I can get to is writing poems in this way. And I'm never trying to mimic it, you know what I mean? I think I'm just trying to appreciate it, and love it, which I guess is what sometimes it means to be curious, is that love. Yeah.
I'm so curious because in a lot of interviews I hear you talk about go-go music and kind of the polyvocal qualities that you're hoping to capture in your music, and the kind of choral feel of it. When I think about the music that I was steeped in growing up, I came from a churchy family. Like I went to my uncle's church. My other uncle was on the organ leading the choir. And so to me, I feel really charged up with the sonic power of gospel.
Yeah.
And it's just, and understanding that as a power. Like, if no shade to the pastor, but if nobody was on those keys, would anybody catch the spirit, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so in the way that you described wanting your poetry to be in that trance mode, to invite folks into that trance, to me, I'm thinking about the maybe less on the stillness tip, more of the get up on your feet and praise tip, like what it is to stir up that type of, to use access the spiritual technology of gospel and that sonic power via the poem. To me, that's poetry can be that vehicle, because I don't play the organ like my uncle, right? And so I'm curious, I would love to hear more about the ways you have been charged up sonically. I'm hearing go-go is a part of it. I'm wondering if there are any other musical traditions that feel embedded in the work.
I mean, go-go is it, and then also gospel. I mean, I grew up going to church as well, and those rhythms are very much in me. And that's what I listen to. I listen to gospel music, I listen to go-go music. That's it. You know what I mean? Like, I listen to jazz sometimes, or like, John Coltrane or Albert Ayler, anybody. But yeah, that's really where I'm at. I listen to a lot of YouTubes of people just playing the Hammond B3. You know what I mean? There's like some I can send you, this little kid who's just crushing it. And it's so moving, you know what I mean? Because it's that moment where it's like, man, that number one, you've mastered the facility of this like thing, but also that you've allowed something to come into yourself, to translate, to move a whole sea of people into this one particular direction together, which is incredible. And go-go music is in the same vein, you know what I mean? It's secular, you know what I mean? Not necessarily secular, but that's what you would call it. It's not, praising the Lord or whatever. Yeah.
Pastor would call it of the world. But
it is of the world. There were gospel go-go's when I was growing up. I went to a few gospel go-go's, and that was pretty interesting.
That's
but
beautiful.
Yeah, that feels like the music that I work from is gospel music. It's gospel and go-go, and then there are other shit that I listen to, but those are the things that I'm working with.
I love this. And when I think about, I raised the small theme of music. I'm thinking maybe now we go to poems, but one of the reasons I read Black As, though it's not one of the ones with lyrics in it, to me, when I think about what the portal is trying to do, I think about the remix. I think about how our music has always, like picked it up, flipped it, like, and created something liberatory out of what was around, and which was what I was trying to do with the wound portal. So just to name that explicitly, though, I did not quite fit the theme maybe on the top lines. To me, that attempt at the remix is very much my musical orientation. And so I would love to invite you, Taylor, to read another poem that feels like it holds any of what we've been discussing.
Yeah.
While you're looking for that, I'll remind our viewers that you can leave a comment on the video that you're watching right now to ask our guests tonight any questions that you have on your mind. I see we have a lot of viewers right now, and we already have a ton of really strong compliments and clapping emojis and all of that. So
Black existential exegesis. This engine and cog business is wigged out. I want nothing we're owed from the ship gig, thence the land whereon modern sound weaned off our cowrie and cached aged conjure. Land whereon our woe is chic and wanted. Shout out to every nigga cajoled into winging it in a crowd, crowing about being the hewer and the hewer's subject. Oh, my aching chore choir, due upon our ochre echo throughout this land, this cadence gag, our ego greeted upon and caged. Grace is our odd crowd, which encores green and geodes. Shout out to every nigga dodging age by ignoring human genre fiction gore, ergo we're nowhere, reneging on being owned and renewed, weighing nothing like race. Shout out to every nigga eroding off the edge of something else, gossamering the air.
I love that poem.
Right on. You know, that poem is a what is that form where you just I essentially constrain myself to use the phrase "we charge genocide" over and over to make new words.
Yeah.
That's how that poem came.
Yeah, I think I read something where you described that, and then I had to go back to see that poem. Like, what? Yeah. How do you do that?
Yeah.
I love that. I'm gonna read a poem called "We Would Hex the President," but we would hex the president, but our bloom game too strong. Altar stays red candle cinnamon lit, sweet flicker cracking into prance. Stays portal door warmed ajar, spell-fung darkward. Wood, but we so black, we lightless. No mirrors, so touch, sound, food, our cedar smoke, drum kicks the body back to gospel. Drumsticks, the body smacked in mouthfuls, the room perfumes with our funk bright wild. Wood, but our skin yams. Plush mothers cackling, juice dripping, and this just our first slow branch ascending. Wood, but neighbors to dine and unstranger, root bind into kin. A nation of misalphaed wolf carcass to climb through. Wood hex their new head, that never man, rot reeking the soil. But who'd feed these seeds? That wet orange howl just compost slime returning. The sky glows red candle, air soots and sludges darkward. Still, our funk bright wild, block by block, our tangling. We would hex the damned born dead, but billions still alive, cored and alive, threshed concave and still sweet flickers. Would, but who needs these feasts?
Yeah.
I'm trying to play with, in my post-book life, poems as spells, a bit more intentionally, not for any book projects, but for my own personal power, community power. And I want to hear more about what you've been experimenting with post-book, and if you found your first project of Inheritance complete, did it meet its mission? To me, when I read to the first line, the first poem and the last poem feel like such a closed loop. Your first poem beginning, since I quit that internet service, I'm thinking more about the transitive properties of books, really setting us up for the poem, for the book object. And that poem concludes, light that sings through me, so I'm singing. And then your last poem, On My Way to You, that ends that distance, that I could cross it, given that you could hear me. And there's so much about, and I adore the sentence that starts that poem: every day is an invitation to intimacy. I decide leaving my house. I have to remember that some days. Like, why am I leaving my house? Intimacy. Yes, yes. And so to me, there's, this song that you're putting out. And the idea of being heard through this book object is kind of what closes that circuit. And so I want to, and maybe before we get to questions from the audience, I want to understand what the book object means to you as someone who is has such an orientation towards the sonic. And we've talked about the sonic resonance with audience. And then there's this book object that just kind of like goes off and does its thing. It seems like the mission of the first book was that hearing, that listening, that sitting and being with the speaker, and doing that deep listening. I'm wondering if you feel like that, well, one, that book object completed that work, or that you feel like you are continuing the mission of inheritance in other ways, either through other book projects or other engagements with audience.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So the poems in here, I wasn't trying to write a book, I'll say that. These poems happen to sound together to form something that made sense. I think when I come to a point in my understanding of my own language, people began to reach out to me, like asking if I had a book, and I just so happened to have these poems. And they came together the way they did. But I don't, in making poems, I'm not trying to, I resist the word project because it does kind of make something feel like it's encapsulated in the end and beginning. This book, I think it is, like I said, kind of the record of my curiosities and my noticings or wonderings or whatever up to the moment of 2019, 2020. And also my understanding of my own language. Now, I think that where I'm at with language right now is, it's a continuation of whatever this song was that was dropped into me from the beginning, whatever this beginning poem is trying to articulate. And it's coming through in sometimes in like more curatorial modes, I would say, like through the project with the Guggenheim, where I'm thinking about space and spirit. And then also through writing this poem called Was, and this other poem called Him that are also kind of long. And then also I'm thinking a little bit more physically these days. So some of the things that I'm working on are involving like me making something physically, whether it's something with moving image or installation. I'm collaborating with a potter right now. Yeah, so I think that, I don't know, it's interesting because I find myself here and there in my practice of being someone who writes poetry, writing something else that maybe I wouldn't even consider poetry. It might be a sentence or two, or like a paragraph or a few. But I think my sensibility is always that of a poet, you know what I mean? And I don't even know if I would identify as a poet right now, because I feel like that's something that somebody call you when you're not in the room. I'm just making things, and I'm curious, and I'm grateful that the world has met my curiosity with interest. So right now I'm just kind of pursuing the things that feel interesting, some of which are like archival work, some of which is sound work. But again, I feel like I'm always involved in the singing, you know what I mean? I don't sing at all, but I'm always involved in the articulation that is this older lyrical thing that wants to move through me in this way. Yeah. How are you feeling right now? You said you're working on spells. When you said that, I remembered that like the word grammar is close to the word glamour, like what a vampire does, you know what I mean? So there's a way that I guess, we've always been doing that, you know what I mean? So I wonder what it means really right now for you to make a spell. What is the intention that you make in your mind in composing a poem to make it a spell, you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, one, I really appreciate your description of your book process, like that it wasn't a project and that you're, because that's how I've been moving. And I remember I'd maybe written half the poems that became this book, and I showed one to a lover of mine at the time, and they go, "This is a bad spell." And I'm like, what do you mean? It was the poem that's in the book, The Lonely Sleep Through Winter. And which is, I mean, to me, it has some humor in it. To me, I love the surreal images, but it is kind of moving through some deep dark. It's, and that's never left me, the idea of a bad spell. I don't believe that. So there are ways I push back on that, but it has, since then, I have been trying to think intentionally the power of the word, and what it is to, if all language is a spell, and not necessarily a good or bad spell, but if the conjuring potential is there, well, what do I want to conjure? Not to say that to discuss the naming is important. There's so much to name just so that we can exhale. So there's nothing that I will avoid naming for fear of it being a bad spell. But I'm like, but what is a spell as intervention? Spell to really think of conjure work and the poetic possibilities there, and not for any book form, but just so that I'm. It feels like such a process of estrangement creating this book, releasing it. I haven't enjoyed it at all. And so I've had to reestablish a type of intimacy between me and the word outside of audience, never thinking that I would really be read before. And now writing not toward a reader, but to reestablish the intimacy that I have with the word. And so the spell being a container so that I am accountable to the poem in a particular type of way outside of what accountability to a project or to an audience would be, but just for its sonic potential to move matter. What is this thing? And it's been a fun form of play for me in this very weird time of releasing a book.
I really think that I hope that, you're able to establish that intimacy, because that's so important. I think it's hard to be in a position where you are received, but also wanted in a certain way that might be depleting, I guess, from that reservoir from which creativity or that muscle that, we make poems out of kind of comes from, because you're doing this other thing that's then like presenting this thing that you've made, which does imply a certain kind of distance. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like, oh no, this part. Oh shit. That's not why I wrote these. All good ones. But
funny,
yeah, some days I'm like, oh man, this was a mistake. But no, I don't really feel that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, to protect the relationship to language, that's my project right now.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
Shady, do we have any? I know we're a minute to the hour. Are there any questions for us?
Well, we have a lot of comments here. Amazing poems, lovely, 100 emoji. Johnny says, I find that power in the single word really clear, really evocative in those single word lines like wound or portal in your poem, Black As, how they open up the possibilities, or how do they open up the possibilities and prepare the reader for the lines that follow?
That being a question, how do they? Or
I think it's a question.
Yeah. I not to punt it back, but I'm thinking about how with the readers completing the poems. I guess, yeah, in naming those sections, wound and portal, I did want to establish a relationship between those two words and two possibilities. That have, there are a lot of ways in our culture that those words are already in relationship. And so, using those associations between the two as entry points into the poem was to intentionally be able to draw on those reader associations. But at this point, I don't know. At this point, I'm way more curious about what the readers are experiencing than I am of my own intentions for the poems. And so if it opened something for you, then that's what it was supposed to do. I feel like there's a lot of space that I wasn't trying to be too tight with my intentions, because I was having a lot of fun. I was playing on the page. And so I guess I do want to be in a conversation more with folks where I get to ask questions like that. So that single line, how did that inform the way you enter the poem? What that little single word monostitch do for you? Because I also don't want to have all of the answers about the work. I love at the end of Taylor, when in your acknowledgements, when you kind of thank the reader for sitting with you and made the whole collection feel like a conversation. And I think want my poems and whatever book objects I create to feel like that as well. Like, okay, you heard from me, now what you got?
Speaking of the reader, have there been any striking reactions or conversations or impressions that have made their way back to you?
Oh, I might tear up. I'm really grateful for the feedback I've gotten, because specifically from folks who have integrated this into their way of surviving. I come to the page from a libidinal impulse to speak, sing, to transmute, because this place is barely survivable. I think, so many Black artists come to their medium for this process of sublimation, with, even if it's not the specific work's intention, it's to just survive. And so when folks have come to me and named the ways that some poems or some collections are now in their little survival guide, their survival kit, that's the only thing I could ask for. That really deeply moves me, and it makes me shut up when in my head I'm like, I never should have done this. These don't have to go nowhere. I know how to send this out. That relationship to those readers, the feedback that they share with me, it is, I don't know, I can't describe how big of a gift that is, to have that feedback instead of the silence of kind of dropping something in a pandemic and doing everything from my house. And then, I close the laptop and I'm in a room by myself, right? So I've appreciated people finding me to tell me these things.
Kemi, I had a question for you that I wanted to ask earlier, which is, and I guess given what you were just saying about spells and the, I guess, divinatory nature of poems and writing in general, just words in general, and how this book kind of talks about different conceptions of the divine, I wondered, in putting this together and maybe in saying these poems out loud to different people, has your conception of the divine changed or been altered in that process?
Wow, I really love this question. This is a blasphemous book on purpose. It felt really important to me. I actually, when I was gathering these poems, thinking do I have this book? I found a note for myself in a journal from I don't know, maybe a decade ago, it was just, stop writing about God and sex. It was just a note to myself, no more. And of course, that's clearly not what happened, right? But to me, it became, at the time I was working in movement spaces where we were just coming up against all of the ways that the right had used the architecture of Christian hegemony, this evangelical architecture, to plant these really reactionary ideas that don't exist in any texts, right? Like that aren't real. Folks weren't anti this and that until some strategists came up in their churches and said some hateful things. And so it was from that frustration that I wanted, and from my own lived frustration of all the ways that my own personal familial religious architecture was anti-me, was not celebratory, that I needed to move in some of these modes. And in reading these poems out loud, and we've discussed what I believe to be the sonic power of some of the spaces that are holding this harm, right? And to me, I think the divine is whatever allows us to be in relationship with each other, with the earth. It is, I want to be on the side of deepening relationships, deep interdependence. And that doesn't take a shape through these poems, but the act of reading these poems, the act of gathering in this way, throughout this pandemic, people in these little boxes, or like through your phone while you're on the toilet. I don't know where you are, right? It can be anywhere, but the fact that folks are logging on from wherever they are to listen. And to me, there's something in that desire to connect, the desire to create and connect, that is divinity, or the divine visits there. It's other orientations, it's other shapes and structures, but that's also none of my business. My business is in the creation and connection that we're allowed, that intimacy that we can forge, the gathering. That's my concern. And I think that's also where I arrive in the poems. There's a lot of rejecting of a heaven, but there's against heaven also as up against this desire for that intimacy and connection is present in the collection as well. And I think those poems locate the divine in that way. And that's only been reinforced as I've been reading these poems in these virtual rooms and feeling so charged up and blessed by that connection.
Thank you. Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you. We have one more question from our viewers. From Sid, what themes, this is a question for both of you, what themes do you hope to conjure in your future writings? Do you aim to explore themes/ideas that are foreign to you? And how do you currently practice doing so?
Foreign, I mean, I guess everything is foreign until I know about it. So everything is kind of outside of my realm of knowledge, so it's in my realm of knowledge. Yeah, I don't know, I'm really curious, so I just be looking at a lot of shit all the time. So I feel like I just engage where my curiosity goes. Yeah, and that's gonna look a lot of different ways, you know what I mean? Might not necessarily be a poem all the time, but yeah. Kemi, how would you answer that? What do you feel like is foreignness to you?
It's my first mind wants to actually reject the mind and go to my body, because I'm actually curious about the somatic experience of poems, both in its composition and then how it's received, but also not just poems. I'm always looking for to anchor in my body and discover the type of somatic experience that shakes loose something. This is like no matter the medium, or even if I'm just going for a walk and want to experience the lake breeze, right? And so when I think about whatever creative work I end up doing after this, I want it to be in with deep attention to the somatic experience that it's producing. And so for a poem, it could be like, okay, like really, what are these lines doing? What do the length of these lines do to me as I'm writing them, and when received, how does it feel? And so that kind of removes me from, so the theme becomes not secondary, because I'm sure that will emerge. But to me, the themes have always been emergent. I have never, the poems in the collection were not necessarily ones I set out to write. And I gathered them because I discovered what had emerged. And so, and I really trust the body. I really trust the body's knowledge and where somatic experience can lead me, if that is my focus. And I'm excited through a practice-based poetics to discover the themes that might emerge, what I get most curious about, what I'll need to or become obsessed with, just like in that journal from 10 years ago, where I'm like, hey, maybe stop writing about this, but I couldn't because those were my obsessions at the time. So through the practice, discovering what those obsessions are, and then deepening, asking more questions from there. But yeah, I have to start with the body and the type of experience I want to render. And then the themes will show up and they'll stalk me and I won't be able to deny them.
Can I ask you one last question, Kemi?
Yes, we could really talk forever, Taylor. I'm just trying to be your friend.
Oh yeah,
that's what all these readings are. Like, who do I want to be friends with?
Yeah, that's true. Well, maybe I'll just email you this. But I want to know if you do listen to gospel music right now, who you like or who you did like.
You cannot judge me for this.
The thing is, I wouldn't, you know what I mean?
Yeah, but like if I'm honest about the very last gospel song that I listened to, which was this morning,
Yeah.
It was Sunday service.
Oh yeah.
You know, the choir that emerged out of a Kanye West project.
Yeah.
And it was actually I think their album came out in 2019 or something. They do this gospel remix of Genuine's So Anxious,
Yeah.
Souls Anchored.
Yeah.
And my intention is in a year from now to do a burlesque routine to that gospel song, because gospel is so kinky to me. It's like complete subservience to or you know, in some gospel music, and I'm really curious about that worship in like a kink context. And so that's the last gospel song I listened to, because, you know, to continue the God and sex theme, I guess that's never going to leave me. And so I was listening to that song and thinking about this routine that I hope to debut sometime next year.
Beautiful. I was listening to the album probably like an hour before we talked.
I love it. It's
great.
Thank you. Okay, I was afraid you were going to think like, okay, where's the old school stuff though? No,
I'm there too. But matter of fact, next time we talk, I gotta tell you my Genuine story. I met him.
What?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm gonna need to hear that story. I also need that YouTube video of the little.
I got you. Don't worry.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. This was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me here.
What a treat. I love your work. I love this conversation. Lost City, thank you so much for having us. I really appreciate the invitation.
Yeah.
Our absolute pleasure and honor. Thank you both so much. To our viewers, you can still get a copy of Against Heaven at Lost City Books. Just hop on over to 18th Street and grab yours. Again, thank you both so much for joining us, and you have a good evening.